Okay, folks, we're going to get started just because we've got a really ambitious program, and I want to make sure that we have time to do everything that we've set out to do. So, my name is Kim Elsbach. I'm the outgoing division chair for OB Division, and I'm really excited about this year's plenary. OB has decided to try something new. So this is all an experiment, but one we're really excited about. What we've decided to do is each year in the OB division is to pick a spotlight topic that is shown to be of high interest to scholars, practitioners, and teachers, and then shine a spotlight on it for a year. What that means is organize scholarly projects, teaching projects, practitioner-oriented events, and advertise them, get them out in the media, make some progress on them throughout the year as a way to show the rest of the world how relevant OB is to practical events in life. And so this year we've started with the topic of inequity in all its forms. We're planning a year of action around inequity. You might have read in the paper this morning that there's a large about a press at Google because an engineer there has created an 8-page manifesto saying that women are unfit to be engineers for a variety of reasons, and that the gender wage gap is a myth. And this is at Google, one of our, the U.S.'s premier organizations in technology. And as you can imagine, this has created a lot of debate. Just one thing that happened yesterday. So as we can see, there's a lot going on around the topic of inequity, and we're hoping to capitalize on that energy through our expertise, our collective expertise in the OB division. So what we're going to do this morning is this. We're going to have 5 panelists who are looking at different aspects of inequity in organizations talk for 5 minutes, and they're going to raise questions and issues that they think deserve further attention. And then we're going to ask you to sit at a table that's got a card on it associated with the topic that you think you're interested in. And we're going to brainstorm for 30 minutes at that table. That table will have a facilitator who will help you. But think about actual actions that you can take in the coming year to pursue answering those questions or other questions around inequity. So for example, in research, you might want to sponsor a special issue of a journal or create a conference. In teaching, you might want to create a teaching website with materials or develop case studies. For practice, you might want to create short news releases related to current research on inequity, or work on a practitioner-oriented outlet such as Org Dynamics on a special issue on inequity, create videos for the AOM website or the OB website on inequity. Think about things that you can start and work on in the coming year and create some energy around inequity. OB will do everything we can do to support you in those efforts. We'll publicize them, we'll try to connect you with other scholars, and all of it will be posted throughout the year on obweb.org. If you go to obweb.org and click on our inequity or special spotlight topic for 2017-18, you will see we have a whole bunch already there. We've got teaching resources, we've got scholarly resources, we've got experts in the area of inequity that you can connect with. So we've already started to create excitement and interest around the topic of inequity, and we'd like to add your voices to that ongoing discussion. Once that stuff's up there, it won't come down as long as you're working on it. So next year we'll have another topic, but the inequity spotlight page will remain up. And we're hoping that this continues to generate excitement around this topic for future years. So We're going to start with the beginning and have our plenary panelists come up and talk about their topic for 5 minutes. After the 5 panelists, then we'll start the work in your groups. So the first topic is the productivity wage gap, and Tom Kochen from MIT has done a huge amount of research on this and would love to get you all interested in pursuing this topic. So come on, Tom. And
thank you, Kim, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for organizing this. I think the issue is so important. I see inequality and inequity as the central challenge of our generation. I use our pretty loosely at the moment, but it's clearly something that is important both nationally and internationally, but it's also important to us intellectually. I don't think that we as a profession have done enough to address the causes of inequity and inequality and what we can do about it. So I'm going to just give you a very quick overview of how I'm spending my time, my research and my teaching, both online teaching at MIT and on-campus teaching to our MBAs, and invite you in a sort of crowdsourcing way as we're organized to join us and figure out how we can take these issues forward. I frame this in the metaphor of the social contract at work, and by that I've defined it similar to the way others have used it. It's just the expectations and the obligations that we all, as workers, as business leaders, as communities and societies, have for what happens at work and what we get out of work. The reality is that work has not achieved our expectations and held up to the obligations that society has for it. And this is just one picture that I think captures the essence of the wage dimension of inequality over the last now almost 40 years. My wife accuses me of never being able to leave home without this graph because I use it in just about all my talks on this issue. It's so vivid. It shows there was a social contract where wages, the light blue line, and productivity, the dark blue line, moved together in the post-World War II time period up until about 1980. And then you see them depart. And we know the story, so I don't have to dwell on it. But this just illustrates the difficulties that workers are experiencing in our economy. The median worker, certainly the lower wage worker, and certainly workers who are subject to various forms of discrimination, as unfortunately Kim reported this morning. This is our challenge, to change that relationship and to find a new way to close that wage productivity gap. In a book that my colleague at Cornell, Lee Dyer, and I have coming out just next month that supports our online teaching on this subject, we identify 3 critical issues that we believe need to be addressed. I'm not going to go into all of these in detail. I just want to highlight them here, and we'll talk more at the tables about them. But the first is we all talk about high road firms, high performance work organizations, organizations that compete on the basis of achieving high levels of productivity so that it can support good wages and then have the practices, the work practices and the culture and the values and the institutional arrangements that produce equitable sharing of those productivity gains. That's number one, and we've got to diffuse those kinds of organizations more broadly. Secondly, this comes from my own long-standing research in industrial relations, we've got to rebuild worker bargaining power in some way that works in this economy and for this workforce. Unions, as you know, have declined. They're not coming back in their mirror image. We've got to figure out where are the sources of power and how to rebuild some mechanisms for worker voice. And then the third really reflects the exercise that I'm going to discuss in a moment. And that is we need to bring all of the stakeholders together. There's no way that any one of these, whether it's business, education, labor, or government, can solve this problem on its own. All of our research tells us we've got to overcome the divisions in our society, and we've got to bring these groups together. So the capstone exercise in this course is to build a new social contract. And we go through an exercise that I'd like us to think about. How could we take this exercise to your students, to your colleagues, to yourselves, and to the larger stakeholders themselves, so that we can get people to say, what are the modern expectations and obligations that we think business, labor, education, and government all need to provide in order to build a social contract that is both more productive for our economy and more equitable in its distributions. And so what we do is it's a two-phase process. In phase one, we have our students in class complete a survey where we give them these categories of workforce capabilities, fair treatment at work, rewards, and you can see the list. And within it there are subgroups, and they can identify which issue they think is the most important within each of these groups. Then they have to write out a proposal. What do they want business to do on this? What do they want labor to do on it? What do they want each of the stakeholders to do? The second phase then is we take the proposals that we get, we have a student group aggregate them into common dimensions so that they reflect the sense of the class, and then we survey at the end of the class and ask participants to simply rank order these and add in other elements that they think are missing, and then rate the overall effectiveness of this social contract that they have built collectively. What I would love to see us do is to, there are handouts if you want to see. I'm not going to go through all of these. Just if I want to really summarize them, lots of emphasis on fairness, lots of emphasis on wage equity, on fringe benefits like health insurance, and lots of a message of lifelong learning, training, and development. Not surprising, but they're fresh ideas on how this class thinks we could build a new social contract. So I'd like to ask, how can we engage more people? And how can we eventually get leaders of these stakeholder groups to engage in these kinds of processes? It's up to you to suggest what's on your mind and see if we can come together with ideas of how to do it. There are ways that we could do it. You could join the online class and have your students participate in pieces of it. You could use the handbook that we have to teach these issues. You could use the exercise in your own classes, or you could help us adapt it over time to get more people to use it, maybe turn it into a game format. Lots of ideas, I suspect, will come from you. So I believe we can address this critical challenge of our time, but I think it's going to require the creative ideas of all of you. Thank you.
Okay, next we've got Forrest Briscoe, who's going to talk about political ideology of leaders and how that might translate to inequity.
Great. Thanks, Kim, and thanks all. It's a tough act to follow. But what I want to do is just introduce a connection which might be intuitive, but also might be a little provocative, and it's based on some research that we've been doing recently. Political values, political ideologies, systems of values that influence behavior. Wow, those are supposed to be red and blue. That's interesting. Well, the dominant axis on which we think about this, right, it's all around us. Liberalism, conservatism, red, blue, left, right. These are things that people hold in their heads. They influence their behavior. When managers go to the workplace, they would influence their behavior in the workplace as well. And in fact, when people sort into groups of all types, even organizations, even the place where you work, you bring some of this political ideology with you, and people sort, in fact, and this is some of the research I'll just briefly share with you, sort in part based on their liberalism versus conservatism in the workplace. So if you think about connecting this to the topic of the day, of course, in organizations, those are sites where inequality is created, people get rewarded, and managers' decisions, policies, what they give for bonuses at all levels of the organization can help contribute to the kinds of inequality we're talking about. What's the difference between the top and the bottom? How do men and women differ in what they're getting rewarded? So the idea is to link these two things together. I just want to show you a couple results from some recent papers with co-authors and suggest one direction this could go. So this is thinking about individual managers, a paper with Aparna Joshi, my colleague at Penn State. So we were able to look at political ideologies of managers because the Federal Election Commission data on personal political campaign donations is publicly available. So if you can match that, you can start to see what people's personal political views are and how they relate to behavior in the workplace. So here you can see on this axis, of course it's a spectrum of liberals to conservatives, and there's lots of folks in the middle. The more conservative a manager is, the bigger the gender gap in the bonuses that subordinates are receiving. And that's increasing as you go up in the organization, even accounting for the fact that, of course, people make more money as you go up in the organization. If you think about another level, whole organizations can tend to be more liberal and conservative. And this is work with Abhinav Gupta, who's now at the University of Washington, but was at Penn State with us. That's, if you can see the white there, that's the distribution of Fortune 500 companies based on the campaign donations of all the employees who made personal campaign donations in those organizations. You can see it's a bell curve, which we like to see as social scientists. Liberalism's to the right, conservatism's to the left. Whole organizations' tendencies affect things that include inequality. So here is the representation of women in the highest paid part of the organization, right, the upper echelon. What this basically shows is over the 2000s, across the Fortune 500, firms that are more liberal based on this kind of the body politique, all of the employees, those firms that are more liberal are adding women into the upper echelon more quickly than conservative firms over time. So it's not a shocker, perhaps. If you think about, there's a lot of political psychology that's been done on ideology, and one of the ways to think about it, of course, conservatives tend to attribute, when they see inequalities, to individual motivations and abilities. Not necessarily that the system around the individual is the cause of it. Liberals tend to see the system or the process or bias as the cause more often. So these aren't, and therefore might be more interested in implementing practices, even as a manager, even in the workplace, that are aimed at reducing those inequalities. So perhaps not surprising, but to the extent to which we find this and we're seeing these big differences in the workplace, what should we do about it as scholars, as practitioners, as advice we give? I mean, one thing, I was thinking about those tech companies. A lot of them have been trying to implement, initiatives to reduce, like, the gender gap among tech workers inside their organizations. But when you think about the design of those initiatives or the framing of them, like what they say their goals are, liberals and conservatives are going to have really different reactions to those things. This is the kind of stuff that political consultants think about all the time when they think about designing programs in Washington, right? But people inside organizations don't think about this right now, at least to my knowledge. So that's one of many directions you could think about taking this. I just offer it as a provocation at the moment. I look forward to hearing what folks at the table think. Thanks.
So this is really, really exciting stuff. Next, we're going to hear from George Banks, who's going to talk about inequity in the experience of leaders and how that affects organizations.
Thank you very much. All right, so I'll be talking about inequity in the experience of leaders. As we've already mentioned several times this morning, if you open up today's newspaper, USA Today, there's an article about inequality in some of the wealthiest and most influential companies in Silicon Valley in the US. So I thought it was very relevant that this is literally, as I was coming over here today, sitting outside the elevator, and so I brought over, a prop to illustrate that. But, this is from, the popular media. We have, of course, lots of research from our academic literature showing that females, minorities, and other people in different demographic groups have different experiences as leaders, whether that be promotion rates or once they get promoted, how they are treated. Okay. So one example of this is from an article in the Wall Street Journal, which showed that essentially stock analysts were more likely to give positive reviews, good reviews to publicly traded companies led by men compared to the very similar comparable companies led by females. This is, of course, a big problem. These are, again, some of our most influential and important organizations. And so to see this type of discrimination occurring at the largest organizations is quite problematic. Okay, so that begs the question, what can we do to try to make some changes to the inequality at the top of our organizations? Can we make some interventions, whether that be very small scale or very large scale? So one example of, I think, intervention that has overall been pretty successful is the Rooney Rule in the NFL. So anyone that follows football, whether it's college football or professional football, knows that there's a little bit of a good old boy system. This is very well documented. And so one of the things that the NFL realized was that they needed to make some sort of intervention to give some of the minority coaches an opportunity to break into this system. And so the rule was implemented quite a few years ago, and we saw some initial success when Tony Dungy faced off against Lovie Smith in the Super Bowl. So you had two minority head coaches coaching against each other. And as another example of success, when Mike Tomlin for the Pittsburgh Steelers won the Super Bowl, nobody even brought up the fact that a minority head coach had led a team to the Super Bowl. They were talking about how youthful he was and how young and energetic and his leadership style. Now, that's not to say that these interventions are always successful. There's contingency factors. So the fourth individual here is Dan Snyder, the owner of my favorite sports team, the Washington Redskins. He seems destined to want to drive the team into the ground, and they may never win a Super Bowl in my lifetime, so I'll pick on him today. There was a time when he wanted to hire Mike Shanahan as a head coach. He wanted to do this immediately, so to check the box for the Rooney Rule, he interviewed a minority head coach who was an assistant coach at the time for the Redskins, while the head coach, Jim Zorn, was still employed. So, this is not really in the spirit of the rule. The spirit of the rule was to interview a qualified head coach that might actually have a chance of being hired. And so Dan Snyder, in that instance, I think, was showing how the intervention was perhaps not effective as we might hope. As another example of an intervention I think is really neat, I was at the Center for Creative Leadership last week giving a presentation, and of course the conversation came up, okay, here's the academic literature for management and applied psychology. How can we make this relevant for the practitioners, the stakeholders of the Center for Creative Leadership? And I was really excited to see some of their work with the Girl Scouts. They had done an intervention, this was in 2014 and 2015, where they implemented a leadership development program for 100 girls in the local community, and so they'd had a lot of success with that and were publicizing that. And so I thought that was a really neat example of how potentially we could collaborate with some organizations in the community, such as the Girl Scouts. They'd done another project with the United Way. Okay, so the questions that I thought would be great to discuss today and over the course of the next year as a part of the Organizational Behavior Division, in what ways does inequality exist in the experiences of today's leaders? What empirical data exist? What can we gather and learn? What types of interventions can be implemented and evaluated to mitigate inequity in the experience of leaders? So as I've talked about before, identifying inequity is one thing, but how can we actually do something about it with our research? And then finally, what moderating factors influence the effectiveness of interventions designed to combat such inequality? So as I mentioned, there's always contingency factors, whether it's identifying the inequity or trying to do something about it. And I'll also add, to conclude, my colleagues and I recently published a paper where we surveyed almost 2,000 members of the academy, applied psychologists, and also practitioners. We had about 1,000 in each group. And I was really pleased to see, we talk about the science practice gap all the time, that the most discussed issue among both academics and practitioners was the need to address inequity. So it seems like people in the field who are outside of academics very much agree with us, in terms of the importance of these issues. So thank you very much.
So George's work really was instrumental in identifying the topic of inequity as our spotlight topic, and so.
Second author here.
And Jeff as well. So now we're going to have Jeff Pollack from NC State come and talk to us about entrepreneurship and inequity.
First, thank you, Kim. We appreciate it, and thank you to the OB Division as well as Brad Kirkman, the COO, for getting this started. You both get the blame and the credit, which is awesome. Imagine for a moment that I'm going to give you $1 billion. Not very excited. All right, don't get too excited. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give you $1 billion. You all are going to be investors, and there are 100 people outside of there who are going to come in and give you 3-minute pitches to try and get some of that $1 billion. Let's play Shark Tank. How many people have heard of the television show Shark Tank? All right, so there are 100 people out there. The first one's about to walk in the door, and I want you to look over there. You're not looking. The first person is going to walk in the door, and I'd like you to write down or mentally note the first 3 things that you notice about that person who's walking in the door. They're walking in the door right now. What are the first 3 things you notice? Who's got one?
Race, age, gender.
Oh. What else do you notice about the person walking in? By the way, that was perfect. What else do you notice about the person walking in?
There she is.
Oh, yes. First pitch for $1 billion. Come on in. Nice. All right. So I focus my research on the topic of entrepreneurship, and a few of my co-authors are here today, so Alex Gloss and Tim Michaelis, among others. We study entrepreneurship, and when we think about the topic of inequity, one of the places where I think inequity exists, perhaps most prevalent in the domain of entrepreneurship, is the topic of, or the context of the business pitch. So in the business pitch context, you have a number of individuals who have money, and you have a number of people who want that money. And you all judge the person who walks in the front door. Oh, no, come on in. Pitch. You judge the person who's going to be wanting your money. This is a problematic context for about 75 reasons. I'm going to talk about 3 of them. So the first reason why this is a problematic context is because you all have the money and they want the money. And so the person, the entrepreneur, is tempted to lie to you and say whatever it is that he or she can say to get you to give that money. So there's an information asymmetry. You all, the investors, have very little information. The entrepreneur has a lot of information. So that's the problem on the entrepreneur side. They're sort of tempted to lie and they have all the information. There's a big problem on the other side, the investor side. You all, when the person walks in the door, you notice the gender, the age, the race, a number of different things about the person, the way they look, which has nothing to do with the actual business on which they are going to be pitching you their idea. And this is a problematic context and creates a bias in a lot of different ways. We know that there's gender bias. We know that attractive males get the propensity of money. So I told you I was going to give you $1 billion and there were 100 people out there. Data show that of those 100 people, there would be 60 males and 40 females. Roughly 40% of the privately held businesses in the United States are female-owned. You all are venture capitalists. The data would actually show that only 2 of those females who are out there in the hall waiting to get your money would actually get money. Data show that 2% of the venture capital deals actually go to female-owned businesses. This is a huge problem and a huge inequity, and so there are a lot of different things that we can know about this. But what we don't know is what to do about it. And so when we think about moving forward, I'd like to leave you with a few final thoughts. Number one, we know that this is a problematic context. We need to come up with something like the business pitch 2.0. So myself and my co-authors are doing a number of different experiments where you have individuals, entrepreneurs, read about a business pitch, see a business pitch, listen to a business pitch, and we're trying to figure out whether these different modes through which investors can hear about entrepreneurs affect the degree to which inequity decreases or increases. We are still in the process of this, and we're coming up with business pitch 2.0. We're trying to figure out whether we actually need to ditch the business pitch. Catchy title, ditch the pitch. We're not actually sure, and so one of the things I'm really excited about is trying to figure out in these small tables how we can actually address the topic of the business pitch to make it better so that individuals are judged on the merit of their idea and their propensity for success rather than the way they look, the way they talk, the way they, their weight, their gender, and a number of different characteristics that have nothing to do with the actual business idea to reduce the inequity in the business pitch context. And I'm thrilled to continue these conversations around these tables, and thank you very much for being here, and we appreciate the opportunity to chat more about business pitch 2.0 and maybe even ditching the business pitch.
All right, and our final presenter is Janaki Goody, and she's going to talk about minority women and the pay gap.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. That's going to be hard to follow with $1 billion and football stories. The first thing I want to point out is I was talking about the title with a communication scholar, and the first thing I was told is the term minority is no longer acceptable because words carry connotations, so the correct terminology is underrepresented. And I would like to point out that that is an error on my slide, so moving forward, every time you see that, please replace that with underrepresented faculty. So I'm a leadership scholar primarily, and this is a topic that is getting to be a little more urgent because from my, not my personal experiences, but the conversations I'm having with women in the field and women who are also established women, sort of, right? Because when we start thinking about pay inequality, one of the first things most people talk about, and Briscoe's work actually speaks to this, is it's heavily rooted in your political ideologies. And the most often used reasoning, if you will, for why these things exist are that, well, there are some causes to begin with which causes people to lag behind in pay and so on, right? So here are a few definitions of inequity versus inequality, and regardless of how you look at the issue, the fundamental thing here is whether it's inequity or inequality, we know that women lag behind men. That's what the numbers show. Now, in addition to that, here's another issue that some of my friends that I crowdsourced for ideas for this talk, one of them described it as, it's almost like, and she's a doctor, and she said, it's kind of like STDs, no one wants to talk about it. And another friend who's a therapist said, it's kind of like, your alcoholic uncle at the Thanksgiving table, and no one wants to call him out and say, listen, you need help, okay? So this is a topic that, first of all, we are not allowed to talk about in the workplace, right? So we are not allowed to discuss pay. Now, despite some regulations being in place, there's some policies that are also going into effect, or actually there are political policies that are being fought for pay transparency in the workplace. Now, all that aside, I think first we need to understand how big is this problem exactly? And I'm really using numbers that are more recent from the Pew Research Center and the US Department of Labor here in a couple of slides. And this first slide shows us the difference between different ethnicities of men versus white males, because the baseline is always white males because they make up the majority of the working population. And on the right-hand side there, we see a number that we are all well aware of, which is 80 cents to the dollar, and that is, in general, white women versus white men, the pay gap, right? But I think something that we talk about much less, or almost it goes unacknowledged, is this gap between Latina women, black women, and white men, right? So once we start looking at Latina women especially, now we are talking 50 cents to the dollar on an average. So, from the standpoint of just the numbers, this just seems like a really large gap to keep going unnoticed or keep going unresearched, so to speak. And I will also say that there's a lot of research that exists more in the macro and meso levels, but the more I looked into this, at the very micro level, the micro foundations, if you will, of this topic, we have very little. And here's another statistic that was recently released in 2015. And again, this highlights the stark differences we see between women of color in general as compared to white women as well as compared to men. And I'm not saying the pay gap in general for women versus men does not matter, but here's another issue that I think is going to become really urgent for us in the next couple of decades. So one of the things I want to point out for our discussion, upcoming discussion, is the caveat I've heard most often in discussing this topic is, well, it's because educational experiences differ, and well, it's because women don't have as many opportunities, and especially Latino women and black women do not have as many opportunities to engage in something called labor force attachment, which is how quickly you assimilate into the labor force past college, right? And the third reason I've heard is, well, women take breaks, and Latino women and black women take breaks more often, and they don't come back as quickly, and that's why the difference exists. So for purposes of our discussion at the round table, I'd like to say, great, we know what the causes are, but so what, right? So we know that these are the causes, but that does not take away from the fact that this gap still exists, right? So just because something is being used as a control variable doesn't mean it's contributing variance, so we still need to understand what are we going to do about it. And one of the things that I found really fascinating, and this is still one of the biggest arguments conservatives use all the time, right, that these are the reasons why the gap exists, it's not really discrimination. But even after you control for all of these factors, data shows that there's anywhere between a 6 to 12% gap. So clearly there's something going on here that goes beyond these early experiences, if you will. There are several macro and micro theoretical foundations, which I cannot get into in 5 minutes. But one of the big things that kept coming up as I talked about this with my own colleagues is this a topic for OB? Is this a topic for OB? And why? What is our goal here? I think that's one of the things I'd like to bring up at our roundtables, and we could talk about it. Are we trying to influence regulations? Are we trying to influence policy? Or do we just want to understand this phenomena? But what is the ultimate goal of the spotlight even on inequality for the next year, right? And I think that will allow us to focus our resources better. And is this a problem that's severe enough for organizations to care? So once we start going on the practice side, what are the expected projected numbers of Latino women and Black women? Because there's a social justice mandate here, right? But there's also a business issue here about when will organizations care? How big does this problem have to be for them to take action, right? And I also thought it was really strange that we have no research on how do you react when it comes to things like, am I going to stay versus leave, or my job satisfaction, or my engagement, or my propensity to engage in deviance, are typical OB outcomes as a function of experienced pay inequality, especially when you're a woman of color in the workplace, right? And then what happens outside of the workplace, because there are some cascading effects here. So these are some questions that I came up with that I thought we could talk about, but really, this topic I think is one of those things, like I said, there are just so many different ways to go with it, but this just is meant to jumpstart that conversation. Thank you.
Okay, so what I want to do now is have you either stay at the table you're at or get up and move to a table of a topic that you're interested in. If you're at a table without a sign on it, you need to move to a table with a sign on it, and there's some up front here. I'm going to go back to the beginning. So these are the topics. So we have 2 tables on each topic, and I would like the so everybody who's up here is going to facilitate a table, and then we have additional facilitators. Could you please stand up, facilitators, Arpana, and Alex, Courtney, Tim Michaels, and Abhinav. So these people are also facilitating tables. So please take a minute. I'll give you 2 minutes to move to a table that you want to work on, and we're going to have about a 35-minute brainstorming session, and I would ask my panelists to go down and sit at your table as well.
Thank you.
There's plenty of room at the front tables. Like I said, there's 2 tables for each topic, so if you see your topic and that table is full, there's probably another table that's not as full. So come up front. Okay, this is about the time when we're going to stop for a minute, and we've got 10 minutes, and I'd just like to go around to some of the tables and hear from your facilitator about any action items that you guys have come up with. And if you're at a different table and you hear an action item at that table that you want to connect with, please make a note of it. Maybe even go connect with the person before you leave. But I want to hear back some of the ideas. So we'll start with the table back here. Courtney, do you have anything to report back? And Laura has the microphone.
So we thought that a mentoring program would be good, where you bring in high school kids and bring them from minorities or underrepresented groups, and bring them in, give them a stipend to come in and meet professors, maybe come in and have something at the AOM or somewhere else where they can be exposed to these options. Because if at high school and college level they're not making decisions to go into, to get a management PhD, then it's going to be harder to promote diversity. We think it starts really early on.
What's your topic?
Oh, leadership and inequity.
Okay.
So, and then we got to that. So it was a little bit of a side road.
Okay. So mentoring high school students about
their options.
About their options.
Yeah, to become management scholars and to do more research on this topic. But we think that would be the best way to.
Fabulous. Okay, so what's your name?
Sam Matthews.
Sam
Matthews.
Sam Matthews. So we're going to get your contact information. We're going to get it up on OB Web. But if you're interested in that topic, talk to Sam.
Hi, everyone. I'm George. So my table is also leadership and inequity.
Shh. Oh, sorry.
So what we did is we compiled our notes through our discussion. We collected contact information. And we also have coordinated with our partner table over here. And so Courtney and I will compile our notes together. We have an email list that if you'd like to be added to it, please let us know. And so we'll share all of our notes. I was really pleased with the conversation we had here. I thought there was a lot of depth. But I thought we also came up with some really cool, specific, actionable items for the next year that we could, accomplish, which was kind of nice because a lot of times you have these conversations and then, nothing comes from it. So, just at a high level, some examples of things that we came up with ranged from trying to sort of understand what existing research is going on already within the organizational behavior division, HR division, and so forth. There's some great research going on, and talking about how we could perhaps, publicize and highlight some of these things, either through posting on the organizational behavior, division website, or doing some press releases so that we can sort of disseminate some of this information to practitioners who might not go to, read some of our academic journals. We also talked about some longer-term solutions that still involves our academic research, such as having special issues, where we coordinate with a journal to do an issue on leadership and equity, where we do topics ranging from sort of trying to do a better job defining what we're interested in, but also looking at practical interventions. So.
Okay. And do individual people at your table, are they going to be the point of contact for any of those? Because that's what we need. We need a person to be the repository for information, and we can put the link on the website to them, because we're advertising it, but we're not managing it. It's you all. So.
Sure. So I guess we thought that we would resolve that through email discussion once we've compiled, because again we haven't had a chance to talk to our sister table here.
That's great.
I thought that it made the most sense for us to compile notes and start a conversation. So
okay.
Certainly,
Thanks,
if anyone feels particularly passionate about the ideas that we've proposed, certainly let us know.
Yeah. Okay. Table back here, Janiki's table. We got to be kind of quick here because we've got like 5 minutes. So.
Okay. So I'll just summarize what we think is going to happen in the next few years. And we don't have a contact yet. We haven't talked to our sister table here yet either. But we'll get to that. But we were talking about actually kicking off a research project on the micro foundations of inequity, experienced inequity in the workplace. And we have someone from Harvard Business Publishing here. She didn't know I was going to put her on the spot. But if you're interested in working on a simulation, we were talking about the simulation itself. And that sounds really interesting. Like she was saying, like you could actually put people in positions of experiencing the inequity, right? That's what you were just discussing. And then it helps them understand what it's like to be in those positions, right? So if anyone's doing work in this area and would like to connect with, please tell us your full name again. Maureen Betsis. She's right here. She's from Harvard Business Publishing, so please feel free to connect with her. And the last project that we had come up here and we're going to coordinate is another subgroup that's interested in low-income wage gap. And something the division could possibly do for them is they're looking for ways to collect data, because that's a hard area to collect data in, and perhaps connect them to state and local agencies.
Okay.
So that's what they needed.
Great. Arpana, did you have?
I'll be very quick.
Yeah.
And Catherine, jump in, because our conversation here was about metrics for figuring out what makes firms both financially successful as well as gender inclusive. And I think we decided that the metrics we currently have, which is board composition, is highly faulty. So to the extent that we can be involved in developing metrics that can be used across firms to figure out what's gender inclusive,
Okay.
maybe one way to go, and maybe a conference around that, a specialized conference around gender and equality
Okay.
was something.
And Catherine, if you're interested in starting that, we'll be happy to publicize.
Something we didn't talk about that is very easy for me to start. So I'm Catherine Klein. I'm at Wharton. Klein is spelled like Calvin Klein. You should be able to Google me and find me. Hi, Adam. Wharton has a partnership with SiriusXM Radio, business radio powered by the Wharton School, on SiriusXM 111. We have a social impact focused show, Dollars and Change, cleverly named by Sirius. We love to have academics on. And we have companies on all the time. But if you have a research topic that you'd like to talk about for us, this would be really interesting. We do 25-minute interviews. They're lively, they're fun, they're
That
easy.
would be great.
And we are always looking for people. Delighted to, they're live on Thursday mornings. And that's really low-hanging fruit.
That's awesome.
So email
Catherine,
me.
can you
We'll
make
get-
sure Aparna gets that information from you before you leave?
sure. Yeah.
And I can put it on the web. Jeff? And we got to wrap up, so.
Yeah, real quick. I'm Tim Michaelis from NC State. At the entrepreneurship table, we thought what would be the quickest, high-impact way to help out would do a white paper targeting the angel networks, the angel investors, to try to kind of separate how they invest in companies, to have kind of a double-blind process similar to the way we do it in journals. So at the beginning, we're hoping put some recommendations in place where it would remove the name, the gender, things like that, even how much money they expect to make with the venture. And then the second time is the in-person pitch, and they get to see all the intangibles and things about them. So I think a white paper with those recommendations might spur some interest in doing actual experiments, but that would take a lot longer. So I think we're thinking about that.
And is somebody going to sort of spearhead the white paper?
So we're working on it. We might actually have someone with a white paper in progress. So
Okay.
yeah,
Wonderful.
We'll let you know.
Great. Let's go over here to Abhinav.
All right, we talked about three things, I think three big bucket items. The first of which was thinking about, we discussed the state of research on political ideology and workplace inequality. And I think we were of the opinion that it has had a particular focus, and some of the important voices are missing from this literature. For example, we don't hear a lot from economists, and particularly conservative voices who would have a view on this topic. So we thought about perhaps doing an interdisciplinary special journal issue. I don't know exactly how the logistics of that would work, but an issue on how beliefs and political beliefs specifically, but beliefs more generally, connect with inequality of workplace would be interesting. Second thing we talked about is creating.
Just to interrupt, somebody has to take the lead on that.
Right.
You know, so decide if somebody at your table wants to take the lead on proposing a special issue, and then you can get partners to help you.
Okay, I guess we gotta discuss that. So the second thing we talked about,
Do you have? Yeah, do it quickly.
Okay, the second thing we talked about is creating a repository or collating reading materials and basically narratives and stories and books potentially, maybe creating a website or some sort of.
So we have that website, so we can put a subsection on it. So if you guys have stuff, we will put a subsection on the OB web.
Okay, that's perfect. So yeah, I'll be happy to be
Wonderful.
involved in that. That's great.
Okay, I'm gonna move on so we get to everybody. Alex?
Yeah, so we had a number of research, practice, and teaching ideas, but for time I'll just zoom in on one. We were particularly interested in determining whether we are properly understanding the benefits of pay for performance, especially long-term and some indirect benefits in an organization. If not, we don't understand that properly, maybe we're not advocating that option as vehemently as we need to. That's one research idea. And then a teaching idea, just for a contrast, would be to ensure that students are more aware of these issues. I think if undergraduate students are not aware of these issues and they go out to an organization, then it's very unlikely that we're going to be able to intervene as successfully down the road.
Okay.
So those are the two main ideas, and I'll go ahead and spearhead that research idea.
That's awesome,
and then,
Alex.
And then Andrew Miller is going to spearhead the teaching idea.
Awesome. Okay. And then the last table, Tom has the last few things.
Thank you. We had lots of ideas about putting things on the OB website. Adam is going to be the recipient of materials that anyone wants to send on teaching materials that helps us understand how you build high road firms, how the investment community and finance plays into it, or how work practices or anything else. There's a lot of research on those issues, and we think that getting more of that on the website so people can teach these issues would be very helpful. Then we talked about blogs and op-eds and so on. and urge everyone to look at your local newspapers around Labor Day, or to think about offering comments on these issues in your local papers. Forget the national ones. Those are all going to be taken well before you could get something to them. But your local papers usually are interested, and then we should put those materials and blogs that we write on those topics on the OB website, and our colleague Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld is going to take responsibility for that. We talked about special issues. There's the journals. A number of journals are getting together to think about special issues on this, so we may have something to say, and that information will get on the website as well. And then finally, two other points. A concern that we get some of the big opinion leaders in business, the Gateses and the Warren Buffetts and others, to maybe host meetings to talk about what would a social contract look like in the future. And then finally, we'll put our social contract exercise on the OB website for anyone who wants to use it in your classes, and we'll build a larger kind of crowdsourced set of results, because all of it will aggregate up, and we'll see where we go from there.
Thanks, Tom. So thank you all for your work today. I'm really excited that so many ideas came out, and you know, not all of them may bear fruit, but we're starting the process. So if you're a spearheader, you know, make sure I or your table facilitator gets your contact information, and you can contact me directly. I'm sort of going to be the main repository for all the ideas, and then use Todd and Deirdre to help make sure they get up on OB Web. So check back at obweb.org on our spotlight page to check in on how these things are going, and to further other ideas to us. And we'll report back next year and see how much progress we made. So thank you so much.